Jack Turner never measured a life's worth in dollars. He measured it in seasons, in the slow creep of snow melt down granite slopes, in the hush before a summer storm, in the way the mountain lakes swelled and breathed like something alive. His family had protected these waters for 3 generations. And to Jack, that guardianship wasn't a burden. It was a calling, carved between pine-crowned ridges in the American West. The lake was more than scenery. It fed the valley's groundwater, sheltered elk, osprey, and a dozen species of trout, and supplied flow to a dam his grandfather had helped build, a structure that had operated faithfully for decades without incident. The dam didn't just hold water. It held the memory of every flood season that never became a disaster, every spring that passed without loss. For most of Jack's life, the valley had stayed quiet. Hikers came and went. Fishing lines broke the surface on still mornings. The shoreline remained largely undisturbed, a buffer zone between civilization and something older than both. Then the investors arrived. They didn't see a fragile ecosystem woven together over centuries. They saw a revenue opportunity with mountain views. Within months, architectural renderings replaced environmental surveys, and a freshly chartered HOA, led by a sharp, driven woman named Linda Parker, was promising the region a new identity, a luxury lakeside community, the crown jewel of Western recreational real estate. The momentum was immediate and intoxicating. Contractors celebrated new contracts. Future homeowners rushed to reserve lots. Local politicians talked about tax revenue and regional revival. Linda, polished and persuasive, spoke at every meeting about prosperity, tourism, and the economic transformation of a sleepy mountain valley. Jack attended every one of those meetings. He came not to obstruct, but to inform, armed with decades of water level charts, dam operating logs, and seasonal runoff data. He laid out a straightforward truth. Certain areas along the shoreline flooded, not occasionally, predictably, every few years like clockwork. Spring would arrive with vengeance. Snowpack would release faster than the watershed could absorb, and the reservoir would climb towards operational threshold. Controlled releases were not optional. They were baked into the dam's management plan, a legal and engineering requirement as old as the structure itself. His warnings received polite nods and little else. Construction moved forward. Cabins multiplied along the waterline like dominoes, each phase bolder than the last. Roads carved through what had been buffer land. Shoreline lots that any hydrologist would have flagged as high risk were sold, cleared, and built upon. The development's marketing photos featured sunsets over still water and decks draped in string lights. Nothing about 100-year floodplains or operational spillway protocols. Jack kept his own records through it all. When the winter snowpack in the surrounding mountains registered at 140% of normal, he didn't panic. He prepared. He cross-referenced the numbers against records from 1983, 1997, and 2011, years when the reservoir had required substantial releases. He filed formal written notifications with the HOA board, the County Water Authority, and the State Dam Safety Office. He had the warnings time-stamped. He made sure no one could later claim they hadn't been told. Linda's board reviewed his notices and moved on to discussing booking rates. Then spring came for the valley the way it always eventually does, with no interest in anyone's quarterly projections. Temperatures spiked in late March. The snowpack, deep and heavy from months of relentless storms, began surrendering itself to the warming air. Creeks that had whispered through winter started roaring. Tributary streams that fed the reservoir ran faster each day. Jack watched the gauges the way a doctor watches a patient's vitals, with calm attention and growing concern. He escalated. He contacted the county sheriff, walked him personally around the dam's infrastructure, and spread the historical charts across a folding table in the operations building. The sheriff, a practical man, studied the data, then drove the shoreline road and looked at the cabins. Some perched barely 30 feet from the water's edge, and understood immediately what wasn't on the HOA's brochures. Public notices went out. Emergency preparedness meetings were scheduled. Some residents came. Others assumed the situation was being exaggerated for bureaucratic reasons. It wasn't. The reservoir reached its management threshold on a Tuesday morning in April. Regulations were clear. The engineering was unambiguous, and Jack's team had verified every piece of equipment twice. following the established operational protocol, the same one that had governed the dam for 40 years. They opened the spillways. The release was controlled, gradual, and exactly what the system was designed to do. Water moved through the channels precisely as the engineers who built the dam had intended. It was not a failure. It was not a catastrophe. It was a lake doing what it had always done when the mountains told it to. But the shoreline was not what it had been the last time this happened. As water levels rose in the lower zones, residents waded through an uncomfortable realization alongside the lake water itself. They pulled out planning documents. They found Jack's original notices. They found the environmental impact recommendations that had been submitted during the permitting process and noted only briefly before construction continued. The information had never been hidden. It had simply never been made inconvenient enough to take seriously. Public opinion turned. Not with anger, exactly, but with the slow, sobering weight of understanding. What had failed wasn't the dam or the lake. What had failed was judgment. Nature, as it always does, had simply kept its appointment. Jack never said, "I told you so." Not once. It wasn't in his nature, and it wouldn't have served the lake. While the community held emergency sessions and exchanged pointed questions about approval processes and permit reviews, he was at the dam, monitoring levels, running equipment checks, ensuring the system remained stable. The lake still needed a keeper, regardless of how the politics resolved. In the months that followed, county officials conducted a full review of the development's permits, construction approvals, and shoreline variances. Several decisions that had bypassed standard environmental buffers were flagged for revision. New planning guidelines were written, this time with hydrological data as a required component rather than a supplementary footnote. Environmental consultants were brought in early, not as an afterthought. The community that emerged from the experience was different. Quieter in its ambitions, more rigorous in its process, and measurably more humble about what it didn't know. Residents began attending planning meetings not as passive audiences, but as participants. Developers who stayed in the region adjusted their approach, commissioning proper site studies before breaking ground. Cooperation replaced a reflexive confidence that had made listening so difficult the first time. The lake healed itself, as lakes do, because it had never been broken. One evening in early summer, with the last light catching the water in long copper ribbons, Jack stood at the dam's edge and watched the reservoir settle into the stillness that follows a hard season. The levels were normal. The system was sound. The pine-covered ridges reflected in the water below looked exactly as they had the first time his grandfather had brought him here as a boy and told him, "This place depends on people who pay attention." He had paid attention. The lesson the valley learned that spring was older than any of them and would outlast all of them. Nature operates on its own logic, indifferent to deadlines, projections, or the confidence of people who haven't read the right charts. It doesn't punish. It doesn't negotiate. It simply continues and invites those wise enough to listen to continue alongside it. On that quiet June evening, for the first time in a long while, it seemed the whole community was finally listening.